What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
This is San Francisco.
This is one of my favorite episodes for the cast of characters alone. We have racist vigilantes, we have manosphere influencers, we have tech industry titans lying to the world and using misnomers like autonomous vehicles when these robot cars that we're about to talk about have humans piloting them. Only these humans are out of sight to further alienate customers from laborers more than they already are, and requiring tons of state infrastructure and subsidies to exist. And we have comrades who are expressing discontent with our tech overlords by burning these cars or slashing their tires or putting traffic cones on their hoods, which paralyzes them. The person I get to discuss this with is Jasmine Ehrhardt, another Asian/Slav from California. Although now Jasmine's at the University of Michigan, where they're studying ethno-nationalism and social networks and other obsessions that we both share. I hope you liked the episode, which made me want to lean further into these things that I think about compulsively for future episodes.
Hello everyone, Tofu here, co-producer and editor of the show. Real quick before we get on with the episode, I just want to let y'all know that if you want to support the show directly, you can go to our Patreon at patreon.com/San Francisco. There you'll get early access to our episodes and also behind the scenes content where me and Toshio just yap about how we make the show. We also want to take this time to promote some friends of the show at the Los Angeles Public Press. They just created the podcast talking about tenant organizing, so if you're fans of our content and fans of the show, we highly recommend checking them out and supporting them. Links will be in the show notes or in the description of the YouTube video. That's basically it for me, and back to the episode.
Okay. Jasmine Lee Ehrhardt, thank you for joining us at San Francisco. And I was hoping that you would set the scene for this episode by reading the first paragraph from your piece that we're going to be talking about today.
Sure. Thank you for having me. On the first day of the Lunar New Year earlier in 2024, a driverless car owned by Google's subsidiary Waymo stalled at the intersection of Jackson and Grant Streets in San Francisco, Chinatown. A crowd of pedestrians, Lunar New Year festival attendees, and revelers formed around the car and within minutes tagged the car with spray paint, smashed its windows, and threw a firework into its front seat. Almost immediately, the driverless vehicle was in flames. 4 brief clips of this event went viral, each less than a minute long. The clips showed 4 different angles of the car pre- and post-firework. The videos quickly circulated across Twitter, accumulating quote tweets and replies expressing alternating delight and horror at the sight of the burning cars. Other videos featuring other angles of the destruction circulated on Reddit and Facebook, which were then recycled, cross-posted, and sent to local news stations. The relative darkness and low-resolution imaging of the videos of the act generated hostile online speculation about the racial identity of the participants, claiming that Chinese people in Chinatown or otherwise would not participate in this act.
Thank you. Yeah. So today we are going to be talking about robotaxis for the first time, shockingly, on this podcast, given that they are
a menace.
A menace. And yeah, just a material kind of the material form of a lot of the things that we were talking about on the podcast anyways, like the new tech and tech sort of taking over, labor that is becoming more and more devalued. But first off, would you kind of talk about when you first realized that driverless cars, quote unquote, driverless cars, were a thing that was happening? And have you ever been in one?
I have never been in one. I've tried very, very hard to avoid it. I have seen them driving throughout the streets of San Francisco. And I think when I first realized it, it was also under the sort of auspices of understanding that a driverless car is not driverless, right? The driver is actually displaced labor, either geographically displaced or sort of removed entirely from the control of the car itself, right? And so when I first heard about the concept of a driverless car, roaming throughout San Francisco as sort of like a pet project of one of the many tech companies that have infected San Francisco. At first, of course, it was the sort of like, oh shit, this again, right? This sort of selling this fantasy of a quote unquote service that has the service worker completely displaced under this auspice of automation, right? That automation presumes that there is now not a dirty human, right? Or a dirty service worker for the person who's ordering the car, who's riding in the car to interact with, right? Which of course is also not true because there is work, there is labor, it is not fully automated that is operating the vehicle, right?
Right.
It's been displaced far away. Lots of other people have written about sort of the hidden labor behind, and I think this is very related, the hidden labor behind machine learning algorithms, which is, underpaid, unvalued laborers in the global South, right? Mostly in the Philippines, in parts of Latin America. And I think the most recent revelation was about workers who are sorting images and words, I think in Kenya. Might want to fact check that. But, I think as more and more we hear about sort of like fully automated services, we have to always remember that there is no such thing as full automation in these things. There is always a person who is working and that person is being paid less than pennies on the dollar, right, to do that work. And so when I heard about driverless quote unquote cars in San Francisco, I was like, God, whose fucking vanity project is this? And what form of labor exploitation is this going to do? What new nugget, what new kernel is this going to represent? So I've never ridden in one. I've seen a lot of them. I feel like every time I am in San Francisco, the number that I see just increases, and it doesn't matter what neighborhood I'm in, they're everywhere. I feel like there was a time where you would only really see them downtown, but now you see them everywhere.
The latest is as of like a month ago, another company called Zooks is in town. It's kind of looks like it's got like a kind of a novel shape in the same way that like Cybertruck is kind of a novel I think generally thought of as like an ugly kind of like hunk of metal with in this case it's got like wide windows, kind of like a people mover. Anyway, so those are in town, just started rolling around SF as of a month ago.
You have these ghost cars, right?
Right. Yes.
They're not ghostly. They're very material. They're right in front of you. They've caused so many accidents, as the infamous one, of course, being one of these taxis hitting and dragging a woman for several blocks, right?
Yeah.
So they're very material, but of course there's no one inside. And so if it were to cut you off, or if you were to pull alongside it and wave at someone or wave someone over, they're not going to see that. So it's alienating also, I guess, for drivers to be interacting with them. But I think that one of the things that I knew about driverless cars in San Francisco and in California broadly was that one of the sort of early forces of opposition against these monstrosities was a Teamsters local that specifically emphasized that this was about to get rid of union protected jobs, right, for like UPS and other Teamster covered jobs. And I know this because my uncle is a Teamster. And so their local was very, very adamant and very vocal about stopping driverless delivery trucks, right? And they specifically pointed to how unsafe they are and also how they threaten union jobs. Which I think is legit. But I also think that there's ways to understand or think about the threat that the driverless car, and I'm going to call it that for the sake of this interview, because it takes too many words to say driverless with an asterisk, and we know what it means, right? We know that it's not really driverless. But actually, effectively, in the streets of San Francisco, it is a driverless car. There is no one in the front seat. And I think that's what makes a lot of the videos that go viral of like driverless cars getting stuck in endless loops honking at each other in certain neighborhoods, right? Or the fact that the car will stop if you just put a safety cone on the hood of the car, which is hilarious.
Absolutely.
Right. I think there's all these different ways that the driverlessness, or the fact that there is no one inside the car, opens up all these different ways for people, everyday people, to interact with and to think about and to understand them. And it's unsurprising that those understandings are skewed towards hostile, right?
Right.
Completely understandable.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. Yeah.
safety
Yeah.
threat, given what they represent in terms of, like I said, a vanity project, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what they represent in terms of a material articulation of like the financial or streams of finance and capital throughout San Francisco.
Right, because these are cars that are on our streets without making a profit. They're not turning a profit.
No.
And in the case of Waymos, for example, they're undercutting even Uber and Lyft drivers by, at least for this initial period, to try to get people on board with the idea of these robotaxis. They're undercutting what you might pay for an Uber ride, and certainly, yeah, a cab ride.
Or what you would have paid for a cab ride like
Right.
10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like this venture capital that we know is a limited source of funding for these things, but being in Silicon Valley, we know that that can last a very long time. So how long are we going to be stuck with them?
And it can last long enough for us to have extremely detrimental impacts, right?
Right.
That even if speculative capital can like kind of boom and bust within an extremely short cycle of time, like it doesn't displace any of the potential and actual harms that come from it, right? And it also doesn't displace, like, again, the vanity behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. Talking about like the traffic, talking about the pollution, talking about the detriment that it does to public transportation by acting as a force that's in competition with public transportation that didn't exist before and is being subsidized by this venture capital to compete with public transportation. It's it's like a lose-lose for everyone except for, I think, like potentially the venture capitalists, potentially maybe a few people that take these cars for a ride as sort of like a novel outing for themselves. But otherwise, I mean, there's so many downsides.
There's so many downsides. And it also, going back to this idea about like the so-called driverless car displacing the consumer from having to interface with a laborer. It reminds me a lot of like, the insistence of contactless pickup or drop off for DoorDash, right? And we've seen how, in places like Twitter, places like Tumblr, and places in other social media forums, this has become like a hot topic of debate, right? I think most recently there was an overblown conversation that was about how women DoorDashers are terrified when the picture of the person dropping off their food doesn't match the deliverer, right? And the implication was, I am scared of men of color who deliver food to me, right? And there's a way that, the putative safety of contactless drop-off for your delivered food with, hundreds of dollars in fees is somehow disrupted by you having to see and confirm that the identity of a person dropping off your food doesn't match what's on your phone. Feels very similar to the demand that I have that you have a car without a driver who could be a minoritized, marginalized person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The point is, dehumanization, or like taking the human out of the equation,
don't bring a working class person near me. I don't want to see it. Right.
Yeah. Which, goes like totally along with the idea that a lot of these tech CEOs have for creating sort of gated, like techno utopias. There was one that was going to be built out in Solano County here in Northern California that recently there was a vote and people were like, nah, not right now, at least. Similarly,
Right
yeah,
now.
I know. Yeah, God, they may be coming back. Um, Hayes Valley here in San Francisco,
Mhm.
Balaji Srinivasan, uh, crypto bro, has ideas for gating off parts of central San Francisco like Hayes Valley and Alamo Square, for the sort of techno elite. Um, so speaking about this Lunar New Year
Mhm.
event, and I can't believe that it's just happened within the past year, but perhaps one of the highlights of
Yeah.
2024 was this sort of torching of the Waymo at the
Yeah.
Chinese New Year parade. Would you describe the mainstream corporate media's response to the
Sure.
torching?
So I saw the videos on my Twitter feed, and funnily enough, they were recorded and posted by someone who works in tech in San Francisco. And like I said, you saw a lot of users responding with both horror and delight. And initially, the response seemed to be completely like grounded within this is an anti-tech move. This is sort of like neo-Luddism. And again, sort of the Luddites are now ahistorically maligned as people who are anti-technology and anti-progress, but in reality, the Luddites were working people who understood that automation was a threat to their livelihood and to their survival as workers. But everyone's allergic to nuance online. But anyway,
Right.
the response was again alternate horror and delight, where some people were like, "Hell yeah, it's about time someone did something about these cars, even if it's something as small as torching one car, right, and not all of them." And I think something else that I remember seeing was a lot of, you know, people pointing out that this was a long time coming, that there had been other sabotages of Waymos, specifically in San Francisco for a while, but that this was sort of the big public showy one. My personal response was, now that's what I call Lunar New Year. Because, at Lunar New Year, you light fireworks, and you play loud drums and you to chase away bad spirits, right? And Lunar New Year usually opens with a bang. And that was continued, right? It was a firework that set the Waymo on fire. It wasn't someone, trying to do something else, right? It was someone threw a firework in the front seat and the thing caught on fire, right? And so there's ways that I was like, I am going to be annoying about this, and I'm going to say, oh, this is how Chinese people should get down for the New Year. But at the same time, I started seeing more and more responses that were suddenly saying that this was anti-Asian hate, that this was
Right.
an attack on Asians to attack a Waymo at this location, right, in San Francisco, Chinatown, and to do this on the first day of the Lunar New Year, that this was somehow against Asians. And I was like, well, hang on a minute. And what was interesting was I saw this being parroted by both troll accounts, well-known troll accounts, and very unknown troll accounts, and some, San Francisco blue checks, people who pay for Twitter and who work in the tech industry, sort of saying, this is, if not a hate crime, this is questionable and disrespectful to Chinese people to set something on fire, as if Chinatown doesn't exist inside San Francisco, as if Chinatown isn't also affected by the threat of driverless cars, as if San Francisco Chinatown isn't also subject to the same kind of gentrification, rising rents, over policing, et cetera, that we see throughout the whole city. And so there seemed to be this pattern of response to the image of the burning Waymo, to sort of say, this is not Chinatown. no one in Chinatown could have done this. And in fact, because
Right.
no one in Chinatown could have done this is against Chinatown and against Chinese people and against Asians broadly.
Right.
You can kind of see how these ideas like just kind of snowballed on each other. And it was literally happening in the space of, a couple hours, and was still going in the morning when I checked my phone again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's like kind of the same narrative that I feel like was sort of propagated through like a lot of the initial Stop Asian Hate
Yes.
movement was like, we as Asians are these kind of like a helpless group of people who needs to be sort of protected by hiring more cops.
Yeah.
Even in cases where like the two of the major shootings that sort of sparked the Stop Asian Hate movement in Half Moon Bay and in Monterey Park, there was an Asian behind the guns.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it's a weird narrative that clearly serves a purpose for some people who are, I don't know, I guess like the like the carceral, like law and order promoting types that are there are a lot of them among the blue check people on Twitter. Also, yeah, certainly in like sort of corporate local news, the Dion Lims and Betty Hughes of the world, these local telecasters.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about the torching of the Waymo is that it really brought together these seemingly disparate strands of reactionary Stop Asian Hate, like posting, because that's essentially what it is. It's posting, right? And I say that not to devalue it, but to sort of emphasize that like a lot of these ideas are circulating online and then kind of spreading offline and being validated. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a way that there's a storm that kind of starts on Twitter, that will start on Blue Sky, that will start on somewhere. Right.
Totally.
And then spread. And so I think the Waymo was particularly interesting to me because to me, it was this sort of apotheosis so far of this idea that a property crime could become racially motivated, right? And specifically, I remember when daytime robberies of elders in Chinatown in Oakland were happening, a lot of people were like, this is racially motivated because these robbers supposedly know that Chinese people don't trust the bank or they don't use the bank. They carry cash on them, right? And they wear gold jewelry. They carry that stuff on them because they don't, or they leave it in their home, right? And I was really fascinated by this, analytical move or this ideological move that was being done, pushed by both news reporters, everyday people, even members of my own family, that robbery in, a time of like, this is 2021 to 2022. So, a lot of pandemic restrictions were still in place. There was still massive unemployment. We were not getting stimulus checks anymore. And I'm remembering how daylight robbery was understood as racially motivated and coming from a place of hate rather than, any other explanation. One of which could be
economics, like
one of which could be living under fucking capitalism.
Totally,
am I right?
Totally.
And so I started seeing this sort of transformation that was happening in real time by saying, oh, property crimes or robbery, this has to be racially motivated rather than a crime against the person, right? Which, and I say this not to sort of uphold carceral common sense about what counts as a violent or nonviolent crime, but specifically because I think that there's a way that this was happening, especially after the summer of 2020, which was a huge, massive uprising of people literally saying, defund the police, kill cops, right? We were getting everything from abolish the police to defund the police. Defund became super watered down. We know it got co-opted. We've had so many conversations about that. But one of the things that I think is unrecognized in that move is that Asians kind of stepped in, and East Asians in particular kind of were able to step in and fill this void of saying, no, we need police because look at the property crimes that are happening against us as Asians.
Yeah.
And I think the Waymo like, to me, the Waymo was like that on steroids, because there was a way that all of these posts about torching a Waymo in Chinatown is an attack on Chinatown, right? It begs the question, is Waymo considered Asian now? Is it Asian by virtue of location? Is it Asian by virtue of how many Asians work in the tech industry? Is it Asian by virtue of certain forms of protest are not allowed and not looked at favorably in Asian communities, right? I'm saying that very, very broadly. But I was still sort of shocked that a lot of the condemnation of torching a Waymo, which, by the way, overdue, right? But I was really shocked that, the narrative of the Waymo being on fire suddenly became about waves of anti-Asian hate. And I was like,
right.
how do you thread that needle? And the way you thread that needle is through this transformation of the property crime into a hate crime, right?
Totally. Yeah. And it is another instance of, why we've talked about it on this podcast a couple of times with Dylan Rodriguez, and why why Stop Asian Hate, like how quickly that was co-opted to serve, a wider white supremacist sort of project. But in this case, like it also fit with, like the media project of like, okay, we need some content about Stop Asian Hate because that's in the air right now. Let's sort of use this as we'll put this into that narrative and see what comes out. And it worked. Also, as the tech industry is trying to sort of humanize these robots and normalize them being around us, giving them sort of cute names, and trying to, certainly, make property crime as I suppose
as hate.
Give it the weight of of a murder for sure.
Yeah, making it as heinous as the shooting in Atlanta, which happened in March, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I will say about the specific accounts that are pushing this kind of narrative and trying to spin these kinds of spectacles online are also operating under the assumption that no one cares about Asians, right? And there's something that to me feels extremely 2015 about it. The idea that visibility of visibility of these sorts of events of anti-Asian racism will somehow provide redress for anti-Asian racism broadly. And whether that, and that means both like structural and interpersonal racism, right? That the spectacle of it online will somehow move people to care more. And we know that that's not fucking true. We know that actually, in the case of Black Lives Matter, very quickly people were like, y'all are sharing these videos of Black people being murdered by police because this is like a snuff film and you are getting the same enjoyment out of it that white people did during lynchings in the South, right? In the 1950s and earlier. That the postcards that are sold of these horrific events of anti-Black violence that are foundational to the US, y'all are sharing these contemporary videos of Black people being killed by police in the same way, right? In the same way that, I've seen a lot of arguments that the ongoing genocide in Gaza by Israel is the most live streamed and the most well-documented genocide in history, but somehow that documentation doesn't move people.
Right.
And I think that, the people who are operating under the assumption that anti-Asian violence lacks visibility, it lacks, people just don't know about it. are operating under the same sort of misguided understanding of what social justice or like redress for racism, structural and interpersonal, looks like. And the only thing that really fills that void then is reactionary politics saying, I need the police to protect me, or I need police to patrol Chinatown, or I need this like white dude, Darren Stallcup, to self-deputize as the Chinatown cowboy and protect any Asian person who might be attacked, right? And so we see how these particular so again, I like want to emphasize that like what happens online doesn't stay online. We see it bleed into the real world very, very quickly. So those things can't necessarily only be dismissed as trolls, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And just as I mean, I hate to give some of these people any more name recognition than we need to, but in some cases, like you said, this is stuff that doesn't stay online. And I think people should be aware that there, in some cases, I mean, there's ulterior motives. There's like cynicism behind some of these accounts or influencers. Are there any names that you might want to
line them
people
up?
A heads up about?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the problems with talking about networks like this is that you sound like a conspiracy theorist. But I think what's important to recognize about this, and I'm thinking very closely about Rebecca Lewis's work and her research on the alt-right and how the alt-right grew its power and platform through YouTube. And, you know, some of the analysis that she shared was like, look, you have these random people showing up on each other's YouTube videos and they're featured guests on this person's show. And then they'll go and be featured on this person's show. And if you're a dedicated watcher of person Y, you'll go and watch person Z. And that's how you end up spreading alt-right red pill propaganda, right? And I want to sort of apply the same principle to the names that I'm going to talk about here, right? They may not be red pilled themselves. They may not be part of the alt-right. They may reject the alt-right entirely, but they're operating on the same platform or the same principles when they move on Twitter, which is sharing each other's content, interacting with each other, boosting each other, etc. So it's definitely people like at Asian Dawn 4, Asian Crime Report, Alt Asian. There's an aspiring rapper named Hear Me Out, who's also part of this network.
I said, they've come through for sure.
There's the supposed Chinatown cowboy, Darren Stallcup. There's also at Asians Against Wokeness. There's also podcasters like Douglas Kim. There's also, you know, venture capitalists like Kane Xie. There's people like Jeremiah Ouyang who, you know, supposedly claims progressive politics, but also like is routinely boosted by these other people, even if he doesn't acknowledge them, right? And we can kind of see how these accounts will also overlap with official Twitter accounts for people like Tony Xu, who's one of the CEOs of DoorDash. And then again, to sort of like emphasize this connection to like Stop Asian Hate, one of the sort of documents that I like to look back at is one of these letters that was pulled together by a bunch of Asian American CEOs. Not just in the tech industry, but in lots of different other industries, that was specifically about in response to the Atlanta spa shooting in 2021. So in 2021, there was an open letter that was ran as a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal, which was signed by a bunch of Asian American business leaders. And the document is still visible as standwithasianamericans.com. And the initial letter had a bunch of different like CEOs and founders of different companies, from like, you know, American-based Korean skincare brands to tech companies to, you know, other venture capitalists who were specifically denouncing anti-Asian hate and racism as CEOs. Right.
I remember this moment. Yeah. And then immediately after being like, oh, I guess this is what's happening, which was in order to stand against Asian hate, it's like buy these Asian skincare products, sort of was the message. Anyway, sorry.
And no, you're totally right, because it seemed like when that statement came out that these business leaders And it's very funny and interesting to me always how, if you're a business leader or if you're a business leader of color or something, that automatically means that you're a leader in the community. And I'm like, whose community? Community, these fuckos.
Right,
Come on.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
And of course, what's really fascinating is that a lot of their messaging became about, I don't feel included at work. You're not including me for promotions. You're not including me for this thing. Da 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 da. Not talking about the fact that I think it's something like San Francisco has the highest number of Asian elders accessing the food bank, right?
Mm-hmm.
That hunger and food insecurity affects Asian elders and working class people a lot, right? I think about the work of Asian Prisoner Support Committee, which is specifically who are full of people who are trying to stop the deportation of people who are convicted felons, right, in California, and who specifically have to fight against sort of model minority stereotyping that an Asian wouldn't go to jail, right? And we know that's not fucking true, but we also know that the state has overwhelmingly criminalized Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders because of gang activity in the 90s and early 2000s that has sort of led to this over-incarceration, right? And this boom in Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. But of course, the East Asians behind standwithasianamericans.com don't really think about that because they're thinking about corporate advancement, right?
Yeah.
And so it again is like, to bring it back to sort of broader Asian American identity politics, we can see again how class obviously is going to structure and fracture any notion of a coherent Asian American belonging, which then of course means that our understandings of anti-Asian hate or anti-Asian racism is going to be fractured and structured along class lines and gender lines, right? And I think that one thing that is baffling to me continually about this network of trolls, venture capitalists, bootlickers, et cetera, in San Francisco is that they really are dedicated to this singular notion of what it means to be Asian American. And to be Asian American to them means to be constantly under threat of racist attack. And I find that also really, really strange. Because it completely neglects any structural racism that we as Asians could experience. Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, and yeah, like a good example of what you're talking about is like the advent of the Asian American Foundation, which came out of the 2021 shootings and suddenly had $1 billion, had amassed $1 billion within 6 months. Of course, all of the people who were coming together to form that were like, the people that you were describing, CEOs and CFOs, and then it was within the first 6 months, like the first big event that they did was here in the Presidio, and it was a meeting between Asian leaders and some government officials. And one of the big takeaways from that meeting was like, we need more representation in the FBI. It's like, we need the ratio of Asian cops is just a little off. But if we can tweak that, then we'll be all good.
Yeah. And I think, it's really interesting that you mentioned this like early conference, and because I think the city of San Francisco has also worked very hard to incorporate Asians into governance structures, right? And specifically, like, there's a very long history about this, in terms of like housing, in terms of, working with like Chinatown Chamber of Commerce and these kinds of things. But specifically, I'm thinking about how APAC or APEC or the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference was hosted in San Francisco in 2023 at the beginning of the ongoing genocide in Palestine by Israel. And the person who was appointed co-chair of the host committee for the conference was Tony Xu, one of the CEOs of DoorDash. And this is after he made an enormous donation to the city of San Francisco of $500,000. And then he got this position, right? for this forum that encourages multilateral and bilateral trade agreements across the Asia Pacific, hosted in San Francisco, which it's, again, San Francisco has historically been understood as an epicenter of Asian and Asian American politics and identity and all these things, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Gateway to the Pacific.
Gateway to the Pacific, right? And so it's fascinating to me then that an Asian American CEO of a tech company like DoorDash would be able to sit on this board and
get access to all of, you know, the biggest world, like the world leaders of East Asia and Southeast Asia.
Absolutely.
Just for a small donation.
And is that Asian progress? Is that materially helping or changing the conditions for Asians and Asian Americans in San Francisco or in the US broadly?
Right. Or in East Asia, where, because a lot of the dealings that, or Southeast Asia certainly, I mean, the dealings that people were having, you're propping up, you know, the Dutertes of the world.
Absolutely. So Asian empowerment where? Asian empowerment for whom? Right? Yeah. And I think that's the thing, is that when I saw the Waymo get torched, I didn't think to myself, oh, it's great. Now I have a tool with which to explain how and why I as an Asian hate a lot of the like liberal stop Asian hate bullshit. I identify as an Asian hater. But I think that seeing this happen and seeing the way that the Waymo got transformed into an Asian American subject or as a victim of Asian hate, right, was really sort of just emphasized for me that these particular forms of political propaganda around Asian victimization and perpetual attack or lurking physical attack against Asians that constantly exists, right? Which I don't say this to sort of to minimize anyone's experience of random attack.
Right.
But I also find that there's ways that people do not want to consider that what seems like a random attack is actually quite structured by the inequality and the abjection of capitalism, right? But the problem is that as soon as you start saying that, people are allergic to sort of think anti-capitalist thought broadly, right? Yeah. And then that automatically sort of throws up a reaction and sort of a block against that, right? The idea that someone could need services and that you suggest that in response to someone who's like, I don't feel safe, or I was made to be unsafe, I was attacked, right? No one wants to hear that. No one wants to have that conversation. And instead of trying to understand, well, why don't they want to have that conversation? I'm interested in sort of saying, okay, well, what got us to this point in the first place that you are so closed off from other people that you're not even open to a criticism around that.
Yeah. And I mean, like with the Waymos and the, removal of sort of the human from transportation, it's like it's the same path that we've been on with, like, for example, other tech innovations, like the way that so many of these like Stop Asian Hate horror stories were spreading were like via apps like Citizen and Nextdoor, that really like a lot of social media, like push the extremes. And it's designed to keep you outraged, and it's designed to feed you things that are going to make you feel bad, right? And that's not to say that there isn't a lot of stuff to feel bad about in the world. Absolutely. Yeah, this podcast would not exist.
Right? But the thing is that I think, when we think about how these videos or these clips, right, or these, screenshots and images of so-and-so getting robbed in an alley, right? Or so-and-so is a crazy person on public transportation. Or we're seeing these other images and posts that demand an outrage at having to see poverty, or an outrage at having to see service workers, or an outrage at having to see, violence in one, like state violence, right? State violence, but it's not recognized as such. We are not the platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, like all the others, they're agnostic as to the content of that post, right? They don't care what the content of the post is. They care that you just keep clicking and scrolling. Right. And there's a certain amount of people who have figured that out and have made it their business to continue to post things that are outrage based, things that will generate clicks, things that will generate views, and also generate followers, which can hopefully, for some of them, like Activation, turn into donations to their GoFundMe.
Right. Yeah. Which we should talk about on another episode. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's so much here.
Influencer culture. Yeah, totally. But yeah, for now, we'll leave it at that for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so stoked. I feel like I say this a lot, but I get the chance to talk to people who are much smarter than me.
I would like to shout out two ongoing campaigns. The first one is for Yazan, who is a 19-year-old student in Gaza. He's been crowdfunding for the last year to survive the ongoing genocide. He's a poet and takes care of all of his siblings. And he's a great poet. You should definitely read his stuff. The link to his crowdfunding campaign is chuffed.org/115145-Yazan. YAZAN.
Okay, we'll put that in the show notes too.
Yeah. And then the other campaign that I want to boost is for my friend and comrade Casey Goonan, who is the only student or the only protester in the overall student intifada who is facing federal charges. They are facing 5 to 20 years in federal lockup. And the crowdfunding campaign for their legal defense is freecaseynow.noblogs.org. All lowercase, no spaces or hyphens. And you should definitely write to them and tell them that you're thinking of them, because we should support all of our political prisoners. And Casey is one of many.
So. Thank you for listening to Sad Francisco. I am Toshio Meronek, and my co-producer is Tofu Estolas. Patreon.com/SadFrancisco is where you can find our past episodes and transcripts, and it's also where you can help us out with a donation. And if you do, it comes with some benefits like getting the episodes a few days early, and our gratitude for allowing us to keep making this podcast, which we love to do. See you next time in Sad Francisco.